Hello, and thank you so much for tuning into the Psychology Is podcast. I'm Nick, and today I'm here with Dr. Rose McDermott, and I think we're going to have an important conversation. How are you in this moment?
I'm feeling a little discouraged, actually. I feel like the resurgence of the pandemic has been depressing, because I feel like there was another way around it, and it didn't happen. And that was partly because of human behavior. So, I know bad things happen in clusters, just like good things happen in clusters, but it's still discouraging that we have to have so many people sick and suffering, and not just the people who get sick, but the people who have to take care of them. And so I just wish it were a better moment in time.
Thank you for that genuine answer. And I can relate. What do you think some of the behaviors could/should have been if we were going to avoid this?
I think the obvious one about more people getting vaccinated, but the less obvious one about, I do think that things opened up too soon. And people reverted to what is normal human behavior, which is social behavior, in ways that happen at the same time as the emergence of the Delta variant. And so it just, becomes a perfect confluence of events to create a perfect storm of resurgence. But the behavioral stuff makes sense, right? I mean, you have a long period of time where people have to behave in ways that are really contrary to human nature, to be isolated. And people, they don't like it. It's not healthy and it's not good. And so they want to return to their normal life. And it makes sense. It's just destructive at this moment for certain kinds of human health.
Yes. And it's just at the forefront of my mind all the time how evolutionarily unprecedented our world is in so many ways. And just the ease of travel and the connectedness of the entire planet of people is certainly conducive for the spreading of viruses, unfortunately, even though it's also so beautiful in so many ways. I read what you wrote. I forget your co-author's name at this moment, but about vaccines and the potential that there is confirmation bias.
Bob Kaplan, yeah.
Yeah, Bob Kaplan. And I appreciated it because you clearly, as you just said, and which, as you wrote in that paper, you are in total support of the widespread use of vaccines, and yet you were shining light on the fact that there's clearly some confirmation bias going on by the people who are experimenting. And, I remember you cited a good example of a paper you read where there was a sample of 45 men, and basically the experiment showed that the vaccine did not reduce sperm count. But then they were willing to generalize that to the entire population of men. And you made the good point that if that result was the opposite and there was a low sperm count, would they still have been willing to generalize to the entire population of men? Yeah. And I'm confident the answer is no. They would have had much greater scrutiny about the study. So anyway, I just appreciated that you were willing to hold both of those, some skepticism about the reporting and the evidence, and your support for the use of vaccines.
Well, and I think that's where, political ideology and how politically polarized and divided the country is now makes it very difficult in some ways for, unbiased science to move forward. I think about this with regard to the ivermectin controversy that's been going on, where, some people are taking it, and obviously there's a version that's for livestock that humans shouldn't take, but there's a human version. And because it's become associated with, conservatives, the liberal pushback has been extreme, but it makes it very difficult to actually look at the data without having it infused with your particular bias of this is good or this is bad based on your prior beliefs that have nothing to do with ivermectin or COVID, but that have to do with, background ideology. And I see that happening everywhere right now. And that I think is very problematic for trying to figure out, if you don't like something, you call it disinformation. Well, if everything is disinformation, then how do we know what's true? And do we even value what's true anymore? And that becomes problematic if you actually want to make scientific advances.
Definitely. Yeah, it is fascinating. And I'm honestly downright confused about ivermectin. And I think many people can relate to that. Is it a prize-winning medicine that saves lives, or is it a dewormer for horses? You've seen it depicted in both ways. And and even just what you said now is, I think, very clarifying for people that there's a version for it for livestock and there's a version of it for people. I think most people haven't even gotten that level of clarity about that. Yeah. And so do you think that there's something about the particular belief system that defines the ideology that is shaping people's view of things like this? Or do you think it's more about just group identity and wanting to believe what your group already believes?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's both. I think that people need to believe what their group believes because it's dangerous to be socially ostracized, especially in a time of isolation. It's dangerous both psychologically, but also logistically. Who's going to support you if you get sick? Those kinds of things. And I think it also, through processes like confirmation bias and other forces, affects top down how we interpret and understand information. I think attitudes work that way. Attitudes in a top down process affect what we pay attention to. Literal perception, what we see, what we hear, how we think about what it means to us. And I think both those things operate and become problematic when you have something that's divisive and controversial and tied to people's identity. And I don't mean identity here in terms of like race or gender or anything, but in terms of, who you believe yourself to be in the world.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by the top-down processing?
Yeah, so, I think that political attitudes are an organizing part of our mental and psychological architecture. And you can talk about something being bottom up or top down, where bottom up is you collect a bunch of information and then bring it together and have an idea about what you think is happening. Top down means there's an organizing framework that directs what you pay attention to perceptually, physiologically, emotionally, that directs you to see certain things, to hear certain things, to interpret things in certain ways that differ based on your ideology. And here I mean conservative versus liberal in a kind of world sense, not in a domestic American sense of Democrat and Republican, but in a broader world sense of sort of communism to fascism, right? Like a basic liberal versus conservative slant on the world. And to be clear, humans need both those things. They need people who are liberals, who are cooperators, who, want to build houses together and raise children together and want to go towards things and seek out happy things. And we need conservatives who are willing to protect us from predators and climate and other groups of people who mean us harm. And who are more driven by being averse to negative things, to be avoidant of things that are, potentially harmful. We can't really have a society that functions for long term without some contribution of both of those sides of the equation. And so different people have different perspectives, but what your orientation is affects what you pay attention to. So if you look at the same picture, liberals and conservatives may literally pay attention to and see different things in that picture. So one of the things that I find frustrating about current debates in American political discourse and other political discourse as well, but is particularly pronounced in the American context, is that people think that the problem is interpretation. Like if I just explain to you why you're not understanding correctly, you'll see that I'm right and you're wrong, and then we'll all agree. And I don't think that's how it works. I don't think the problem is interpretation. And that's the problem with all these arguments about what we really need is just deliberation, and that deliberation and compromise and talking will help us overcome these problems. I don't think the problem is interpretation. I think the problem is perception. I think people literally see and hear and value different things based on their priors, which are ideologically informed and at least partially genetically informed as well. And so I don't think it's as simple as we just disagree on the interpretation of the facts. I think we disagree on the facts. And that becomes problematic when it gets applied to things like COVID, right? And vaccines and masking and, things like that, where there is a kind of, scientific truth, for lack of a better term, not perfect, but better than not knowing it, that becomes problematic.
It's as though people are operating in two different realities.
Yes. Sometimes, and it may be more than two, right?
Right. Good point. Right. Which definitely makes it hard to cooperate with each other.
Yes.
I sometimes people say like, I would embrace the statement perception is reality to the individual perceiver.
Yes.
I think, of course, we can have perceptions that are incongruent with reality completely. I've gotten to know many people who've had hallucinations and psychotic episodes, and they would definitely confirm that their perception of reality was incongruent with some more fundamental objective truth. And so we could easily kind of go down that philosophical road here, but perhaps we won't. But it is, I just think, very important to realize that, like you said, it's not just the level of interpretation, it's the level of fundamental perceptions of what is happening. And that I also think that sometimes we would maybe even report that we're operating with this bottom-up operation of understanding the world, that we are objectively collecting information and that's informing our views. I think that sometimes we think we're doing that when we're actually encountering the information we encounter because of our top-down pre-existing beliefs, essentially.
Well, because there's real, I think that's a really good point, because there's real self-selection, right? We seek out the things that we want, but also the things that we expect, and avoid the things that we don't expect. And so there's real self-selection into jobs, into relationships, into experiences that are guided by things we may not be fully aware of.
How can people become more aware of their own perceptual filters?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? I think that the ancient philosophical traditions would tell you things like meditation and mindfulness practices, and modern psychiatry would tell you it's therapy, and I suspect it's different things for different people. But I think the reality is that most of us are not very aware most of the time. And that's important because it saves a lot of energy, right? And if you think about how expensive brains are in terms of glucose, we don't want to be aware of having to beat every beat of our heart or every breath of our lungs. We need a lot of those things to be automated. And unfortunately, other things get automated that we might want to have be more conscious. Including our ideological orientations.
Yes. Let me give listeners and watchers a little bit more context if they don't know you yet. So Dr. McDermott is, as my friends and I might say, in like the world of sports, a beast. And that is a great compliment, meaning you are someone who is just highly productive, widely respected. Honestly, I sit here, I look at your educational and professional background, and I see that you earn your bachelor's degree in political science from Stanford, and then you go to Columbia University and earn a master's in political science, and then you come back to Stanford and earn another master's in experimental social psychology, and then you continue at Stanford to earn a PhD in political science, and then you get additional professional training as a postdoctoral fellow at UCSF and at Harvard. And then since then, you've been awarded huge grants to do significant research, and you've been a professor at Harvard, UC Santa Barbara, currently Brown University. I think there's Cornell as well. So, you know, that's an elite resume, and I'm not saying this to flatter you. I'm just acknowledging it, and I was about to say too that it's interesting to look at that history and think, okay, I was a baby at the time you were earning your second master's degree. And it's just humbling, and such an honor that a person like you, so established, would give me the time of day and and join me in conversation. So I actually just have kind of the random question. What has it been like to be educated and educating at such elite institutions your whole life?
Well, first of all, that's very, very kind of you to say all those nice things about me. That's kind of not how I perceive myself. This is really like my fifth career, right? Like I've had a lot of other jobs before I sort of became an academic and in between being an academic, many of which were, manual labor jobs. I painted houses for a living for a long period of time. And so, it's a weird trajectory, but there's parts of teaching at elite institutions that is very humbling, and I feel like it's a huge honor, but there's also a real difference across institutions, right? So like when I was at Cornell, which was my first academic job, the students are amazing. You learn things from them all the time. I had a lot of hope for the future of the world. And then I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I was like, oh my God, we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket and we're going to drop into the ocean, because it was all sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And that's great for them. But I felt like they were mostly waiting for their grandparents to, as they called, kick it so that they could inherit all the money and just live their life of party and privilege. And it was very frustrating. A lot of them were close to functionally illiterate. And this is not a bad school, right? I mean, it's not like, some kind of community college where you expect that sort of behavior, or that kind of background where you really need to help people from the bottom up. And then, I went back to a place like Brown, where again, it's just, unbelievable students who are brilliant, and I learn a great deal from them, and they sit on enormous privilege. And so there's part of that that's very disconcerting as well, because it's not a representative sample, and yet the disconnect between their brilliance and their commitment to social justice and their complete comfort with their own privilege sits side by side. And it's challenging, right? It's challenging to have so many amazing students who remain, to go back to our earlier conversation, a bit unconscious and unaware of their own sanctimony, and the way in which they restrict each other's speech through social ostracism, the way that certain kinds of ideas are no longer allowed to be discussed, the way that certain kinds of identities are no longer allowed to be present. That is problematic. To give you a simple example, the two best read articles in the Wall Street Journal yesterday was an article about how white men are no longer going to college. And the decline in men in general going to college has dropped precipitously in the last few years. But nobody can try to help them because they've been so privileged across history. But then the problem becomes the second most common article that was mentioned, read yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, which is increasing numbers of college-educated women have children on their own. And those two things are not disconnected, right? What's happening is there are not enough suitable, eligible mates for the women who want to have children in their 30s with college education. And so letting men drop out of the system isn't good for women either. And those kinds of discussions are not possible to be had, because the minute you say, hey, there's a problem that men aren't going to college, all you get is how men have been privileged throughout history, which is true, but then you're not allowed to go beyond that conversation. And so those kinds of truncation around a particular kind of political acceptability, I think, is detrimental for everyone going forward. And I see much, much, much more of it now than, say, even 5 years ago. There's been a real sea change in discourse that I really date to the iPhone, right? So you can really see it happening starting in 2007, where everybody has a smartphone and things really start to change in terms of discourse. I really agree with Jean Twenge on this. I think that social media has been an enormously destructive force at every level of society.
Yeah, what a unique perspective you have. I mean, even just, I honestly haven't known anybody who's had jobs in manual labor and attended or worked for such elite institutions. That's a very unique perspective, and probably primes you to see more clearly what you just explained that you see so clearly. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I agree. I think that, listeners and watchers who haven't watched The Social Dilemma, I think I'm getting the name of that documentary right. I'll feel silly if I'm not. Pretty sure it's Social Dilemma. I think
So
that's
The Social Network, that one?
I'm going to look it up right now. I'm going to be my own Jamie. There's a guy named Jamie on Joe Rogan's podcast who does this type of stuff. I'm going to look it up really quick. Yeah. It's The Social Dilemma.
Okay, you're right.
Absolutely fantastic, and examines the psychology of, exactly how people's psychology is essentially exploited by social network companies. And it does it in a way that I think is very memorable for people, and just in the way that they kind of enact some of the psychological principles. For example, they have actors acting like the algorithm who is determining what to show this person on their feed next, all for the sake, of course, of enhancing an addiction. So it's just extremely well done, and makes this point, that you just stated, that it is net a destructive force, even though there's so many positive things about it.
Yeah, I mean, I know when Zuckerberg started Facebook or whatever, he was like, oh, I'm going to connect the world. But that was not his original motivating force. His original motivating force was vindictive. And I think that that's been the consequence of it, because that was, in fact, his intention. And, forget the skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety, particularly in adolescent girls, which I think is endemically destructive. But it's destroying democracy. It's causing the death of hundreds of thousands of people through COVID misinformation. I mean, he's this generation's Stalin. We just don't talk about him that way, because he could stop it and he won't. And the reason he won't is because it makes him a lot of money. And that's not, even for people who endorse capitalism, that's not okay, because there's other models by which he could make money without being so destructive. Make it a subscription where people have to pay $15 a month. That's how we got great TV, right? Netflix happened because we pay for it.
Good point.
Facebook could be a really different platform if you force people to pay for it. and you'd get rid of bots and you'd get rid of, lots of other problems, but he won't do it. And it's all about his personal profit. And that kind of psychopathic narcissism then feeds on itself and grows and becomes increasingly destructive across all levels of society. And, I know that that's a really not okay position to have, but I feel very strongly about that.
Mm. Mm. As people like to say, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product.
That's right. That's
And
exactly right.
yeah, I would much rather pay. And I bet it could just be a couple bucks a month and they could be plenty rich if everyone paid a couple bucks a month and didn't see advertisements. And I think people tend to think it's a neutral medium and
It's not. Right.
but it's not neutral.
No, and I think the other thing that people don't know is the hidden costs. Like, for example, Facebook hires all these people who have to sit and watch video all day of things that people mount so that they can take down stuff that is, human beheadings in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're watching the worst of human behavior, 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week for months on end, you're giving those people PTSD.
Mm.
And there was a class action suit against Facebook by Irish people in Ireland who had those jobs, and they won. And, does the average person who mounts pictures of their grandkids think about the consequences that they are imposing on all these other people who have to monitor the network? I don't think so. And I think if they did, they might think twice, maybe not on everything, addicts are addicts, but I'm not sure people are aware of the broad scale negative consequences that happen as second order effects from their behavior.
Mm. I think that's definitely true. I want to come back to a statement. I'm paraphrasing you, but you said political attitudes are part of the architecture of our psyche. Mm-hmm. And is this kind of what you mean? I know you edited a book called, I believe, Man is by Nature a Political Animal.
Yeah.
So is this what you mean by the political nature of human beings?
Right. So what we meant when we talked about that is to say that it's impossible not to be political.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of what human nature is. And that everyone has attitudes. They don't have the same attitudes, but they have attitudes. They may not have attitudes about everything, but they have attitudes about some things. And they might not even recognize them as attitudes. They have attitudes about what appropriate relationships should be between groups and between individuals and between parents and children and between, husbands and wives and between, the government and the governed. And everyone has attitudes. It's built into the architecture of human nature. It's how we became social animals. And it's not just humans, right? You see it in primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, some element, not advanced politics, but some element of group behavior that can be considered political. And so there's an evolutionary and biological and genetic component to it that's inherent in our psychological architecture.
Let me ask you this. A simple question. What does it mean to be political?
So the way that I think about it is ideas, thoughts, and attitudes about the appropriate relationship between individuals, between and among individuals.
Mm. Yes. And I mean, when you put it that way, no doubt that is inextricable from our nature. Yeah. So I do want to bring up the topic of nuclear war and the psychology of war and violence. But since we're on the topic of just the political nature and, we were talking about ideologies, I know you've done some work and I'm thinking we can just talk about it for a few minutes, let you summarize it and people can look into it much more. And then we'll spend the rest of our time on nuclear war violence and everything. But the work you've done to recognize the biological factors associated with political attitudes. even genetic factors. So I don't know if it's easy to do this, but I'm wondering if you can just kind of summarize what you've learned about the biological factors associated with political ideologies.
Yeah, I mean, I can oversimplify a bit, but a lot of the work that I've done, primarily with my co-author Pete Hatami, has involved, and other collaborators, has involved looking at twin studies. So we look at, the difference between identical twins who are basically the same person born in two different bodies,
Mhm.
and fraternal twins, which are like any other sibling set, but they're born at the same time. And through sophisticated and complex mathematical procedures, you can investigate the difference between those two groups and see what component and element of a certain outcome you care about is related to genetic factors, which are related to environmental factors that are shared, like the home environment or the school, and unique environment, things that happen only to you.
If I can just super quickly interject this, I think it's helpful for people to understand that the reason that this is so valuable to understand the role of genetics is because, as Dr. McDermott just said, identical twins are genetically identical. Their
Yes.
genome is exactly the same. And so, therefore, arguably, any differences between them on any level must be due to factors besides genetics. And then with fraternal twins, I've had people wonder, well, why not just study any two siblings? And it's true that genetically they're no more similar than any two siblings, but you do control for a lot of things, even just, if nothing else, exact same age. And then often fraternal twins are sharing so much of the environment. So anyway, just wanted to interject that because I think it's helpful for people to have that in mind. Please go on.
No, that's very, very helpful clarification. So, these kinds of studies have been used in medicine for a long time, right? To think about things like risk for cancer or, other kinds of genetic diseases and disorders, to look at environmental influences that may affect people. In fact, there was an article yesterday in the paper about two twins that were born in 1962 in Virginia, and one got vaccinated and one didn't. And the vaccinated guy's alive and the unvaccinated one just died of COVID, right? And the only real difference between them was, because they were identical twins, was that one got vaccinated and one didn't, right? I mean, there's other factors, but they were talking about it that way. But to go back to the other thing. So in various studies, we've examined how these things differ by political ideology. And there's different ways that that's measured, but in a lot of the genetic studies, it's done with this thing called the Wilson-Patterson test, which basically gives people a bunch of prompts, abortion, affirmative action, things like that. And you say yes, no, or I don't know. And that categorizes people into liberal or conservative or, whatever. And across that spectrum. And we've been able to do this across many continents, across, from data that comes, that's pretty old as well, like more than 50 years old. And what you find is that there's a really consistent aspect of political orientation that is genetic, meaning it's not determinative. It's not like, oh, if your mom's a conservative, you're going to be a conservative, but that it's genetically heritable and informed. And depending on the particular topic, some things are hugely genetically informed, like ideology. Other things like party identification, much less so. But when I say informed, I want to be pretty clear. So you'll get this data that says, 0.6. So 60% of the difference is genetic. That doesn't mean 60% of my ideology comes from genes. It means that 60% of the difference between me and you, Nick, and my mother and my colleague and whatever is attributable to genetic differences. So, that's also kind of the way that, like, if you do 23andMe and it tells you you have a certain risk for a certain kind of, cancer or whatever. It's not that you yourself have that risk, but that the population differences. So you can't attribute any one person to what happens in the population difference, but the population difference tells you why, sort of in general terms, the likelihood that differences are attributable to these factors. And what you notice when you start looking at the things that are genetically informed in ideology is they tend to fall into these three kinds of baskets that make sense from an evolutionary perspective, meaning they're things that you can imagine humans had to struggle with over millennial time. So every generation had to deal with this problem. And so those who successfully negotiated it passed their, genes onto their kids. And those who couldn't successfully negotiate it didn't have kids. And so those variants didn't necessarily, go into the next generation at as high a degree. And they tend to be things, obviously, around sex and reproduction. So issues around resource allocation, right? Who gets what? And issues around in-group, out-group behavior. Whether or not you're going to protect your in-group and not have immigration, whether you're going to protect your out-group and have war. And the thing is that these are underlying issues, but across time and space, they may manifest as really, really different issues of the day. So take, for example, sex and reproduction. In 18th century England, issues of sex and reproduction may look like fights over prostitution or pornography. And in 21st century United States, it might look like issues over transgender bathrooms. Or transgender rights, although clearly the vote in Texas the other day says we're back in the abortion debates, right? And so some things never really get resolved. And what those issues are about is who gets to decide what somebody else's sexual behavior should be, right? Not what my sexual behavior should be, but what your sexual behavior should be. Who gets to decide? Do I get to decide? Do you get to decide? And who gets to make that decision? That's the political part of it. So, these days, issues of in-group, out-group look like immigration and look like, withdrawal from the war in Afghanistan. But at different periods of time, they may have different nuances, but the underlying, what we call latent variable, the underlying variable is really consistent across time. Those things are hugely genetically influenced. There's other issues that don't necessarily go across millennial time, and they would not be as hugely influenced in terms of genetics. They're more environmentally determined. And that's what the twin studies help us figure out. So that's not exactly a short answer. I'm not sure it's even a comprehensive one, but that's how I've come to think about this issue.
I wouldn't hold you to providing a comprehensive answer about decades of work in a few minutes. So that's a lot to digest. And yeah, that's super interesting. So what I understand you saying is that when you really drill down to essential issues that have been taking on slightly different forms throughout time, but there's an essential issue here, such as, attitudes about sexual behavior and who gets to decide how people engage in it, there are recognizable genetic differences in the attitudes that people will take toward that.
Yeah. Think about it in conservative versus liberal terms, right? So, classic liberal, everybody gets to do whatever they want and it's fine, right? And classic conservative is nobody gets to do anything that they want, right? That it's basically constrained ostensibly for the good of everybody, right? Like you can argue about whether or not that's true, but that's the belief. And so, no sex before marriage, no abortion, no, like you can go down the party line about those kinds of things.
Right. Do you think that there are core personality traits that incline someone toward one attitude or another, and that, for example, maybe a propensity toward order, someone who has that trait where they need things to be orderly, perhaps they would be more inclined toward conservatism, and then someone who's more spontaneous or that trait, more open, would they be inclined toward liberalism? And could that be what the genetics are kind of manifesting as, is just these fundamental psychological traits that tend to resonate more strongly with one ideology or another?
Yeah, so if I can back up a little, and this might be a kind of nerdy answer, I'm not a big believer in personality. I don't really think it exists.
All right.
So I think, Walter Mischel did a lot of work showing that what
Mhm.
you get is sort of temporal consistency. So I might behave toward my mother the same way now as I did 40 years ago, but I'm not going to behave the same way toward her today as I would toward you today. So
Mhm.
you don't get a lot of cross, um, you know, um, uh, the same behavior on the same day with different people is going to be different, and you get more temporal consistency than cross situational consistency. That said, I do think there's temperamental differences in individuals that are sort of physiological. Some people are more agitated and some people are more chill and, whatever.
Mhm.
And you do see what I think of as preferences. And, Jonathan Haidt has done this work in ideology, and I really have issues with him, but his work is really good. He's really smart. And he talks about how conservatives have these 5 areas that they really care about, one of which is the one you identified in terms of order. And 2 of them really overlap with liberals. So liberals really care about, fairness. They really care about, caring about other people, sort of what you think of as, empathy. Um, and conservatives care about that too. It's just that they care about other things as well that liberals don't care about as much, things like order, things like purity, things like authority. And so if you think about it that way, then liberals sort of, they put 50% of their care into these 2 buckets, whereas it's divided among 5 buckets for conservatives. And so they're going to pay more attention to things that liberals don't care as much about, like authority, like order. And those are preferences. What I think about them as preferences for different kinds of political structures and social structures, not just political structures, but social structures, like how people get along in the household.
Mhm.
Um, and so I do think that organizing order is part of that top-down preference, right? Part of that top-down ideological preference, where conservatives are really going to care about authority, that you listen to what your father says and do what your father says. And, they're going to care about sexual purity and sanctity and things like that, religious organizations and so on, in ways that liberals may not pay as much attention to or give as much value to on average.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's the way I think about that issue, is not so much in terms of personality and more in terms of these top-down orderings of political and social preference
Mhm.
orderings and structures.
Mhm.
Does that
And
make sense?
it does. And so you're saying that, exactly what sort of belief system gets put in place as the top of the top down processing is partially associated with genetics. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Informed by genetics, meaning
Informed.
it's not determined, but it's influenced by.
Yeah.
And I just want to emphasize this issue. I think the minute liberals hear genetics, they think of eugenics and determinism. And not everyone, but that's the
Sure.
kind of standard, like, oh, that makes you a Nazi. And that's really not how it works. And I think it's really important. This is one of those places where I feel like underfunding of science education for 30 years has really
Mm.
been detrimental to American public discourse. Because, biology is by its nature inherently flexible. It has to be. We wouldn't survive as a species if we weren't exquisitely sensitive to environmental inputs and, incredibly responsive to flexible changes in our environment. Um, People who live at the top of the Himalayas and at the bottom of the ocean, and as divers in Fiji, are the same species, but they adapt to different environments in different ways because of changed physiology and biology.
Mm.
And oftentimes liberals also think of environments as fundamentally malleable, and they're not. Think about how hard it is to change public housing, right? Public housing we know is a disaster, and yet the buildings have been there for 50 years, and we know they don't work, but we don't bulldoze them, right? And so I think we have a really fundamental misunderstanding of how impervious to change environment often is, and how flexible and adaptive biology is by its nature. And I think it's important for people to understand both those things in order to understand how genetic heritability does not mean essentialism. It doesn't mean, oh, if you're this way, then you're going to be this way, with the possible exception of Huntington's disease, right? Like, okay, if you have that gene, you're going to have that disease. But, even people who have genetic markers for other kinds of illnesses, some of them do get it and some of them don't. And it's because of lots of environmental factors that are in interaction constantly with biological factors as well. And so I just think it's really important for people not to think that because something is genetically informed, it means it's deterministic. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And I find that discussion very, very frustrating because it's the common trope.
Mm. And that, I think, should instill hope, or it does instill hope in me, that things are not going to necessarily become increasingly polarized and extreme over time, because as I've heard you talk about, people tend to reproduce with people who align with them politically. And so that means that mating would contribute to polarization politically, given that you're kind of homogenizing the gene pool for each political ideology in a sense. And so the fact that, biology is flexible and adaptive, as I noticed you wrote something, I really like the phrase, it's biology is flexible and adaptive, but not unstable. Right. So there's some stability to it, of course, that we don't have to convince people of. They already believe that too much. So we're trying to convince people that it's flexible and adaptive. So just the fact that it is flexible and adaptive does instill some hope that things are not just going to turn into this two homogenous, extremely different political ideologies over time. I love everything we're talking about. I want to pivot to the topic of nuclear war. I read on your website that you're involved in some projects related to nuclear weapons, and every time I start a new class, like I'm a professor and we just started a new semester, and every time I always find myself talking about how psychology is very important because of many reasons, one of which is the fact that I think humans are our own greatest threat to our survival as a species at this point. And we've developed nuclear weapons. And whether or not those nuclear weapons will be detonated with bad intentions or defensive intentions, whatever they may be, whether or not those go off, depends on the decisions of people who have a mind and a belief system and a value system, and they have a psychology. And so if we are ignorant to the factors that would influence that decision, that's a problem. Existentially, that's a problem. So, this is a big intro into just asking you about let me add this context too, because I didn't necessarily know this before I started looking into it. According to what I found, there are over 13,000 nuclear weapons on the planet right now. And Russia and the US harbor the vast majority of them. Russia has over 6,000 nuclear weapons. The US has over 5,000. And then I believe that next is China and France, and they're in the 200 or 300 range. So that in itself is very interesting, that if we're measuring, I suppose you could say, power of a country by nuclear arms, Russia and the US have an unspeakable amount of power. So just that context, I think, is good for listeners. And my question to you now is, what psychological dynamics must be in place if we're going to avoid nuclear war?
Yeah, I think that's the, $1 million question. And it's really hard because I feel like there's a lot of psychological tendencies, especially around the desire for revenge when you're harmed, that work against the prospects for peace and stability over time. So since the dawn of the nuclear revolution, let's call it 1945, we have depended on this notion of deterrence for our survival. That I'm going to believe that you're not going to attack me because you know that I can attack you back in a way that makes it meaningless for you to attack me because you won't win anything out of it. We'll both, have ashes in our mouths, right? To use Kennedy's phrase. Mm. The problem is that changes when you think about things like suicide bombers, right? If I don't care that I'm going to survive, then what's going to stop me from destroying you? If I have a political and religious belief that, I'm going to get my benefit in the next world, not in this one. And this becomes particularly worrisome and problematic when you think about the spread of weapons of mass destruction through terrorist networks in places like Pakistan in particular. So Pakistan has nuclear weapons. The AQ Khan network has, engaged in proliferation, both with Iran and North Korea. I mean, you can see these ways in which these materials and information spread that are problematic. And you say, okay, well, maybe that's only one nuclear weapon here or one nuclear weapon there. But, they've done modeling, for example, showing that even a small, quote unquote, small nuclear war between India and Pakistan would basically precipitate a nuclear winter that would kill everybody on the planet, right? Because you would destroy the ability of the sun to, the sort of opposite of global warming, right? And so, you really have to think seriously about how we're going to prevent their use. And there's a lot of psychology that works fundamentally against the notion of deterrence. Deterrence is, fundamentally rational, but we know that lots of people aren't very rational, right? And again, this goes back to underfunding education, but when someone hurts you, the natural evolutionary instinct is to kick back, right? Is to hurt them back. And that notion of revenge undermines the stability of deterrence. Mm. And that's, to me, the big concern. And so there's lots of issues that are related to that, but to me, not the least of it is political leadership. If you have a political leadership structure, like in the United States, where one man, and it's so far, every president has been a man, has the ability to launch nuclear weapons without any kind of consultation or, sign off from anybody else. If that person is vengeful, if that person is crazy, if that person is impaired, it puts all of us at risk in ways that we can't control. And so you can at least think about putting in a series of procedures and regulations and rules and laws that constrain the ability for somebody who is impaired to wreak that kind of destruction on the wider universe. And that's what I think is really important. Paul Slovic has done some really interesting work on this related to some pieces that he calls virtuous violence, which is a lot of people justify the use of violence, not necessarily as like something bad, but as something good because I'm protecting my in-group. And there's a very strong evolutionary human desire to protect our in-group, but protecting our in-group often means wreaking violence on the out-group. And so how do you transform that kind of virtuous violence in a way that constrains it so that we don't destroy all of our the entire planet? And, we have a lot of nuclear weapons, although we have a lot less than we did at the height of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 90s when there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. So there's been a huge reduction in that through arms control treaties and negotiations, but we still have way too many, right? We still have way too many nuclear weapons. Does it matter if you can destroy the world 70,000 times versus 10 times? Doesn't really matter, right? And so, a lot of the efforts that I've seen and been part of have been designed to try and think about strategies to stabilize the rules and norms that constrain the development and use and proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also to think about ways to encourage increasing decommissioning, right? Like happened after the Cold War to now. And I was hoping that, one of the things that the Biden administration would do when they came in was restart this process of arms control with the Russians. And, it's unclear whether and to what degree that will start up, because there's been so many other issues that have been front and center, not least of which is the withdrawal from Afghanistan and issues related to COVID.
So I'm putting my naivete on full display, but that's okay. I did not realize that number was that high, that there were 70,000
Oh, yeah.
nuclear weapons at one point. I was aware that there were more than there are now. So that's encouraging. But you make the very good point that it doesn't matter how many times you destroy the world, it only takes really once for us to lose our habitat. So there's still too many. So this decommissions, you use that word. I mean, does that mean that literally nuclear weapons are being disassembled? And
Oh, yeah, they have been. I mean, not all of them.
right.
But, for example, there were a bunch of weapons in the, quote unquote, near abroad when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, that were not part of Russia, that were like in Ukraine and places like that. And the United States actually paid a lot of money. I mean, you can think about it that way, to allow them to take the weapons and decommission them. And they take out the nuclear material. Sometimes they use them in, nuclear reactors for energy. Sometimes it gets done in different ways. But yes, they get dismantled. And that's good. And we've done a lot of that, and we need to do more of it. But whether or not we'll ever get to the point where, each side has one nuclear weapons, the way that we did with smallpox, right? So smallpox, there was a big debate about whether or not to completely eliminate the, one remaining smallpox vaccine. And basically they didn't do it. They kept one in the CDC in Georgia, and Russia has one version of it. Because the idea was, if there's some rogue version somewhere that no one knows about, we need to have the genetic material to come up with, a vaccine or some kind of other treatment. So they didn't destroy it. And I think nuclear weapons, that's the best you can hope for. You're not going to ever get rid of the technology. You're not ever going to get rid of uranium and plutonium, but you can, diminish it to the point where the risk, especially of accidents and inadvertent use, is diminished greatly.
So there's reason for hope. And, I can't help but think just this idea of violence, virtuous violence, and, what it means to be a powerful person or a powerful entity. And to me, I've always seen truly powerful people as capable of protecting themselves and disarming their attacker without necessarily injuring their attacker.
That's
and
right.
Maybe if they're a true master, they can even facilitate a transformation in their attacker to where their attacker no longer wants to attack them, but wants to be in good standing and in cooperation with them. And you see that, I think, we can all imagine, just if you're an adult, imagine that a little kid, a little 4-year-old is trying to beat you up, trying to punch you and kick you. What would you do? You would just subdue them. Simple. We wouldn't punch them in the face. You wouldn't fight back and defend yourself way too aggressively. You would just recognize you're way more powerful than them. So you subdue them and teach them why they shouldn't be doing that. And I think there could be an equivalent of that with entities in the world, government entities, countries. It's almost exposing an insecurity in the leaders of these countries who feel this need to stockpile. And it's like saying, well, what are you compensating for, in a sense? And are you truly powerful, or are you just kind of scared and defensive?
So I love your interrogation about what is really power, what's the meaning of power and what does power look like? And, the example of the 4-year-old is telling, because there's enormous amounts of child abuse, right? And there's enormous numbers of people who do beat up their kids and who kill their kids. LA County right now has 60 active cases of people who've basically killed and tortured their children. And that's LA County. right? And so people are not very rational.
Right.
People are driven by their emotions in ways that are destructive, not only to the child, but to themselves. And so that's what we want to do, is not have people like that be in control of nuclear weapons, right? Not have people who can't control their own emotions. And so that's where I feel like, to go back to our earlier discussion about awareness, part of what would be great is a way to train self-management of emotional reactivity in high school, the way you teach algebra. It's way, way, way more valuable than algebra, right? But we don't teach that. And yet that's crucial. And that kind of insight, people aren't born with it, right? Like, you have to develop it, and you often develop it through good parenting, but there's a lot of bad parenting. And so, I think that question of power to me is so fascinating, because power also means when to restrain and constrain yourself, as well as other people. So you protect yourself, you protect others, but that's not necessarily, as you said, dependent on attacking others. It can be a kind of social jujitsu, right? Where you convince other people about why it's in their best interest to join you in this cooperative effort. But that takes a kind of self-awareness, not the kind of just reactivity. I'm going to punch you because you hurt me. I think about it like with dogs. I used to have a German Shepherd, and there was at the park this little Jack Russell Terrier that was always like, rah, 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 and he would nip at his, heels. And the German Shepherd just wouldn't pay attention to him. He'd just ignore him. And then, one day the Jack Russell Terrier went for a different part of his body, not his feet, but like his neck. And then the German Shepherd barked, and he tossed the Jack Russell Terrier. Like, he had power, and he knew when to use it, and he knew when to not use it. He wasn't going to bother when it wasn't a problem, but when it was a threat to his life, he used it. He didn't hurt the other dog, but I think about that kind of behavior where you don't have to use the power you have, but when you use it for the right reasons in the right way, which is to defend your life and the life of the people that you care about. But you don't get a lot of self-awareness around that in many people. And I worry that, even in democratic systems, we elect people without vetting them for that ability, right? Like, we don't necessarily have them go through, it's not like you have to go through some psychological test in order to run for president. You probably should, but you don't. And so, that's where I think about, okay, if you can't do that, then let's come up with rules and regulations and procedures institutionally that constrain everybody, good and bad, in ways that protect us all. Because that notion of power is so fungible, and it is so individually defined.
Beautiful. Is it naive to believe in a future where there really is some degree of world peace, where there's no war or threat of it?
I don't know. We think about past times in world history when there was a kind of world government. And, people talk about like when the Catholic Church ran the world, sort of prior to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That was true for the Western world, but then you're ignoring China, you're ignoring, the Eastern world that wasn't part of the standard canon and what was going on there. And okay, maybe it wasn't as developed, but it was developed in a different kind of way, and that doesn't make it irrelevant. To me, I'm not sure. I think we have too many people on the planet to like have one world government or, kind of world peace in that way. But I do think that you can structure institutions of cooperation that seriously reduce the risk of large scale warfare. I have a very odd take on this. I think that violence starts in the household. I think it starts as kids look at their parents, and if their dad beats their mom up, they learn that violence is the way that you get what you want. and that coercion is an effective form of dominance. And if you grow up in a household where your parents talk it out and they compromise, then you believe in diplomacy and sanctions, and you have these ideas about how cooperation and compromise emerge. And you take those ideas and you graft it onto the larger world. And so for me, when I think about what we could do to effectively change what world peace looks like, it starts by reducing domestic violence, not just toward kids, but toward partners. And I don't see a lot of movement in that direction, and that discourages me, because I think that those micro practices are how we learn macro practices as adults. And the violence that women and children sustain in the household, I mean, there are men who also are victims of domestic violence, but not to the same degree. Until you can think through alternative rules and regulations and enforcement mechanisms that reduce that, I don't know that you have a lot of prospects for improving things on the world scale. Sorry, I should be more hopeful, but
no, I mean, I'm always, I just think it's so important as a psychologist to look squarely into the face of the most ugly, disturbing, dark human tendencies. And that's the only way we would ever minimize or prevent them. So I appreciate you going there. My goodness, this world we live in.
I know.
It's just,
and it lives side by side with people who are generous and loving, and
yeah, right.
You see incredible acts of heroism and sacrifice. I mean, I know right now the big thing is to celebrate the healthcare workers, and a lot of them are amazing. But to me, like, the real heroes are the firefighters. I'm living in California among the fires. I know you are too. It's not as bad around here this summer as last summer. But those people, they're amazing. I mean, going into the fires for days at a time, risking your life under such conditions of heat. And sure, they love it. But to me, that's power, is that strength, that courage. And you're not doing it just for yourself. You're doing it for your community. And that's the kind of thing that gives me hope. Those people who, go into incredible situations of risk every day on behalf of the broader community, often strangers, people they don't know, that never ceases to fail to inspire me. And that's where I find hope, are people like that. I wouldn't have the ability or the courage to be a firefighter. And so I always find that really inspiring.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. That hits very close to home for me, because both my brothers are firefighters.
Wow.
Yeah, for the Palo Alto Fire Department. So they're nearby you, and their names are Daniel and Adam Fortino. And I can honestly say that they are heroes of mine. They are just such men of integrity and courage. And yes, the details that they have shared with me about the fiery hells literally that they have entered, or the people in the traumatized, injured states that they find them in, and just to help on that immediate dramatic level is heroic. And so, yes, thank you for bringing that up. I couldn't agree more. My gratitude is just infinite for my brothers.
I think they're the most amazing people around. I actually have a friend in New Haven who just had her baby delivered by firefighters because they couldn't get her to the hospital soon enough. I just think, I know, again, the thing is, healthcare workers, and I happen to know some that are amazing, but also some that are complete jerks. And so I prefer the firefighters because I think they're all amazing, just incredibly. To me, that is the paradigm of strength, because there is a kind of generosity and power in it that is about protecting your community, and that requires a lot of physical strength. It's hard physical labor, but comes from a real generosity of spirit. And that's what I wish that we could inculcate in colleges way better than we do. It's all about going into high tech, which, okay, you make a lot of money, but are you really helping people? I don't know. I think Facebook has been more destructive than helpful, as we discussed earlier. But firefighters, They're amazing.
Amen.
And that to me is like, that's what out-group protection, in-group protection and out-group discrimination looks like as a firefighter. They are just
Mm.
amazing.
Mm. I love hearing you talk about it, and I could not agree more. And even, I think my brothers are both also involved in helping people get hired with departments. And I'm learning that to be competitive, it's really helpful at this point to also be a licensed paramedic
Oh,
because
that's interesting.
yeah, so you don't have to be a licensed paramedic to be a firefighter, but it certainly helps. And both my brothers are, and that combination of expertise, it's
Mhm.
just about as practical and helpful and life-saving as could possibly get. I mean, paramedic, first responder, and then also understanding fire science. It's just, gosh, what a relevant expertise and just absolutely life-saving. So I appreciate you singing the praises of people like my brothers.
Yeah. Well, thank you to your brothers. It's a vocation, it's a calling,
Mm,
and it's a really sacred one. I
mm,
mean, I really think, we would do well to think about how to use that as a model for how to um, construct. This is going to sound old fashioned, but I'm going to say it anyway, construct notions of masculinity going forward,
mm,
right? We've lost touch with those models. And I think it's problematic, not just for men, but for women in society. And again, I know it's not popular to talk about these kind of engendered terms, but when you think about reproduction and mating, it's hard not to think in those kinds of terms. And um, when you think about historic notions about and historic meaning millennial notions of what masculinity is, a lot of it is about protection of your community.
mm,
And that's what a firefighter is. That's what they do. And it's very different than writing code, right?
mm.
Not that writing code is bad,
Right,
although sometimes it is.
right.
But to think through what tactile, physical, somatic protection looks like,
Mm,
not as beating up your kid, but as protecting your kid, that's what will transform the world, right?
mm,
Um, and we need to do a better job of um, thinking through how to let that be acceptable and model it and train it and not disparage it, because we all need it. Or we're all going to be jumping in the bay because the fires will take over our houses
right.
and the floods, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about the first responders in, New Orleans or in New York or New Jersey or the places where there's, horrible hurricanes where people die. I mean, I live in fires, but it's the same thing of the first responders who, are part of the Cajun Navy and go out and, rescue people in boats and stuff like that. It's that same instinct.
Mm. Yes, and there is a spirit to that. What is motivating the people who help in that way, that is worth just, deep examination. And maybe the question people can ask themselves is like, how does that manifest in me personally?
Right.
Maybe I'm not a firefighter, but maybe there's some way that this sort of extremely, just I keep using the word practical because it's like, let me back up and say this too. I just feel like firefighters, first responders are so in touch with real danger.
Yes. Yes.
And when you look at the way violence has manifested and evolved over time, war activity, I can't help but notice that it's become less and less of actual physical combat and more of the use of technology.
Yeah.
There was a day when people fought with their fists and then sticks and then simple tools, but face to face, you smell their sweat, you see their eyes, you look at their blood, you're right there. And then we developed, bows and arrows and guns, and we could fight from more of a distance. It's much less personal. And then we developed, bombs, and now we have people shooting, controlling drones from
Yeah.
across the world like it's a fucking video game and killing people like that. And And when you're killing someone from that level of being removed, you're just killing an abstraction in your mind. It's almost like, obviously, in reality, you're killing somebody, but to you, the person perpetrating that violence, it just seems like it would be easy to disconnect from the reality that you're
Oh
killing
yeah, you
human
have
beings.
complete de-individuation, and
Right,
it is
right.
like a video game. And then you go home and you play with your kids. Like
Mm,
that really warps your mind, right?
yeah,
It
yeah.
really does.
Mm,
So, I mean, I agree with that. I think part of the problem with the, forever wars is that we didn't have a draft, right? That it was inculcated in this very small percentage of the population who was not well integrated with the rest of the population. So the rest of the population could sort of forget that we were in this war. And yet they're morally responsible. We're all morally responsible. We pay for it with our taxes. We allow our government to do this on our behalf. And we may not like it. Individuals in there may not like it, but it's easy to not think about it because it's a very, very small percentage of the population who has to bear the costs. And that's unfortunate because, again, if you had a draft where senators and Congress people's sons and daughters were fighting,
mhm,
you wouldn't have as many wars.
mhm,
And they certainly wouldn't last as long.
mm. Friend
Yeah.
of mine, his name's also Nick. He's a veteran. I think he served in the military for 6 years, multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. And he has a tattoo that says, "When the rich wage war, it's the poor who die."
Yeah.
And it's just another example of the way that, what war really is for some people, for the people who are physically fighting it is one thing, and what it is for the people who wage it and strategize behind the scenes, it's quite another. And it's just disturbingly similar to a game to the people who are not actually
Yes.
fighting it.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm always, aware of the time and
Yeah, I
how.
actually do have a meeting in like 5 minutes that I'm
Okay,
going
well
to
then
go
that's
to.
perfect. We're right in sync. I can't thank you enough for spending time with me and sharing all your wisdom.
Thank you, Nick. You've been amazing. You're such a great interviewer and such a
Oh,
thoughtful and deep listener. It's rare to find someone like that. It's a
wow,
real
you made me
talent and a
cry.
gift. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to be connected with you. Have a wonderful day,
Thank you.
and
You
let's stay in
too.
touch.
And, thank you to your brothers.
I will make sure they listen to this, so they'll hear it from you.
Okay.
Take
Thanks
care.
so much. Bye.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.